Hi, welcome back to another web development video where I show you how to make modern websites using HTML5, CSS3, and a little bit of JavaScript. In this video, we're going to continue our series on CSS Subgrid, which is a specification of the CSS grid layout. In the previous videos, the first video I talked about what is Subgrid and just showed you an example of how to use it and what it looks like. In the second video, I talked about how Subgrid, I think, is going to change the way that we write our HTML. It's going to create a flatter structure to our HTML, which makes it more semantic and gets rid of some of our wrapper divs and like some of the extra code that we use in order to create different layouts. And what it allows us to do is to connect. We've always been able to use grid to connect the direct children of the grid to the grid that we created, but now we can actually take the children of those children, so the grandchildren of the grid, and we can connect them to the super grid as well, which allows us to, I'm in this Adobe XD program here. I think it's going to allow us to create more like, we're going to be able to write code more like we design in a design program like Photoshop or Illustrator, where we have a bunch of elements all over the place, and they're essentially there's an underlying canvas basically, and then all of those elements exist sort of on top of that super grid, but they exist on the same level, the same hierarchy, even though we're able to sort of separate them out. As you can see here, we have a header, and this would be a section, and then a footer. Those would be our HTML5 semantic elements. So it allows a screen reader or a robot who's coming to index the page, it allows them to understand more of what's happening on the page, but it also still gives us the freedom to see these elements as individual elements, not necessarily elements that are tied together. So just like you could physically pick up and mix and match these different elements at different sizes or different canvas widths or whatever, you would actually be able to do and manipulate in the code the elements the same way, and be able to manipulate them on the grid structure. So that's the hope with CSS Subgrid. If you haven't watched those two videos, I think they'll help you to understand this video, which is going to be creating an example of what CSS Subgrid might look like in an actual real world example. So this is only viewable in Firefox. So if you have the newest version of Firefox, you'll be able to see Subgrid. Otherwise, you won't be able to actually see how the Subgrid works by looking at the code examples. So just make sure that if you open the Codepen, that you're doing so with Firefox, because that's currently the only browser that has support. Others are coming from what I understand, but not there yet. Okay, let me set up my workspace here. I'm just going to do this in HTML again. I typically write with the Pug, which is an HTML preprocessor. It's sort of like Sass for HTML. It's very cool to check out, but sometimes people get a little confused why I'm not writing brackets and things like that. And then for the Sass, I'm just going to turn that off as well. You could certainly use Sass for this. There's nothing inherent that I'm going to do that you can't use Sass for. Some things with CSS Grid you have to use vanilla JavaScript and you can't use Sass, so just know that that's the case at times. So what we're going to do is start out with our structure. So basically we're going to recreate this. Let's put that back. We're just going to recreate this page, and what we have, we're just going to build our wrapper. And I'm still trying to work out like how this is going to work best. So this is sort of a first pass at a single page. Maybe as time goes on, People will bring up, you know, you could have done this better, or you could skip these different steps just by doing this. If you have those sorts of comments or suggestions, leave them in the comment section below. I'm not the preeminent expert in the world of web development, so just trying to figure this stuff out just like you are as we go along. So first I want to just sort of have an outside div, I guess, that's called app, and then everything is going to go inside that app wrapper. That's going to be our grid. You could just as easily call this grid. I still don't know if it's okay to do display grid on the body. I haven't tried that yet, so I've only tried it this way. But inside that, we're going to have each of our HTML5 sections. So we know we have a header, and we know we're going to have a couple of different sections. Actually, we're going to have 3, right? So we have 1, 2, 3 sections, and then we're going to have the footer down here. So I am utilizing Emmet. If you're not familiar with Emmet, it allows you to kind of shorthand type in what you want, and then when you hit tab, it just creates the HTML for you. So if you want a footer section, you just type footer, click select. Emmet is actually a part of Codepen, so you don't have to download anything to make that happen. Excuse me. And so now we have our 5 sections, our header, which is going to be like our masthead or our header at the top of the page, then each of the different content sections, and then our footer. So let's go ahead and build out the HTML for these as well. So inside of our header, we're going to have sort of a name type logo, and then we're going to have this this list of 4 items. So let's go ahead and do let's do an H1, and we'll call that logo, and we'll say grid like this. And then we're going to come down, and we're actually going to create a nav element that we'll call main nav. And then inside that nav element, we'll have an unordered list with 4 list items, and we'll just sort of copy these down. I'm sure in Emmet there's a better way to do that. I've never gone past sort of the basics, but I do know there's a way to fill in content with Emmet. Not quite as familiar with that because I've been using Pug instead of Emmet, so I do my shorthand in Pug. So now we have these items here. This can be our navigation, so we can even give this a class of nav links, maybe something like that. You can name each of these if you want to. One of the beautiful parts about Subgrid is it's going to allow us to utilize maybe fewer classes and more pseudo elements, pseudo classes, pseudo selectors in our CSS. So I'm not going to show a lot of that in this particular video, I don't think. I'm just going to go ahead and name and specify each one because we don't have a lot of elements here, and nothing is dynamic, everything is static, so to me it's not going to matter that much necessarily. So in our sections are pretty simple. So the first section, we have an image and we have some text, right? So we're going to come into this section, and let's just go ahead and give this section a class, and that's going to be intro, maybe. And then we'll have an image. The source, I'm going to use Unsplash. Let's see if I can remember it. Source.unsplash.com / and then we need a size, so we'll say 1600 by 900. That's HD. And then we need to give it some, you can just let it do a random one, or you can choose a keyword. So my keyword is going to be Chicago. I'm not going to put any alternate text, that would be something that we do on a production website. I don't really care about that right now. We're also going to have, let's just do the lorem ipsum. Mangled that. Okay, so in Codepen, if you type in lorem, I don't know, 75, and you hit tab, it'll actually create some lorem ipsum text for you. Let's see if we can do that with Emmet. So we get our P and we say lorem 75. Okay, it doesn't do it for us. So we just create our P text or our P tags here. Okay, so we do that. Now we have our paragraph text, which is down here under our image. So this is our intro section. The next section is going to be, we'll just call this article, something like that. And this will be an image and text and then a caption. Okay, so we have 3 different pieces. Now, one of the cool things about this, and I'll show you right now because it's going to look funny compared to what you see visually. One of the cool things about Grid and Flexbox both is it allows us to write the source code, so the HTML. We can write that code one way, but we can present it visually a completely different way than what the source code allows. Now, what Subgrid is going to allow us to do, I think, I'll have to test this for a different video, but I think it's going to allow us to even at different breakpoints to write the source code the way that we're going to write it, and then have the elements, you know, like this could come down here on a smaller screen size, or if someone was using a particular browser. Like, I think we can do that. I don't know for sure yet. I'll have to still test that. But I think that's going to be how it works, because it's all connected to this outer grid. It's no longer, it is relative to this section, but it also kind of isn't relative to that section. So I think that's going to work. I'm not totally sure, but I do know that what I'm about to do is going to work. So in the source code, what I want people to do, remember that whenever someone is going through this website, they go top to bottom, left to right. So whatever they encounter first is what's going to be read aloud first or whatever. So I would really want them to hear the text before I heard an image. Like if I was listening to this website, I would want to hear what's in the text, because honestly what's in the text is going to be for someone who's listening to the website, that's going to be really the key part that you're trying to communicate. For someone who's looking at the website, the visual is going to mean something, it's going to matter. But to someone who's reading, they're only going to hear what the alt text is or what the URL is. And that's just not nearly as meaningful as hearing about what this section is about or what are you introducing. So the images almost always on a website are sort of secondary. They're supporting in a lot of ways. And so I want to put the primary information first, and I want to put the supporting information second in the source code. But you can clearly see that as we're going down the page, this image, if this were a grid, you know, the grid lays out left to right, top to bottom. So it's going to lay out this way and then come down and lay out this way, like this. So visually, this image needs to be before the text. And with Grid and with Flexbox, we can do this, both with the order property and with and with specifically placing things on the grid in different areas, which is what we'll do today. Okay, the next section, another text section, an image, and we're going to have a little bit of more text, and that's going to be the caption. So I'm just going to copy this because it's essentially going to be the same thing. We might have to change the length of the text, but we're going to have our primary text, we're going to have our image, and then under our image we'll just have a little caption. So I'm just going to copy this down to, it's too long for our caption, so let's just make this something like that. And we'll just make it all one. Something similar to that. So now we have this little caption that's right underneath, and it sits underneath the image. It doesn't make sense necessarily to me to have the caption above the image. Maybe that's more understandable for a screen reader, but I'm not sure. I am not an accessibility expert. I try to learn what I can. And then our last section has 2 images, and so we can just copy down these images twice, just like that. And so now we have our 2 images down here in our last section. Let's give these sections some names. Our first section is called intro. The next one is going to be a class of article, I guess. We can even call this article and make sure that's changed. So in Codepen, it connects it and changes it for you. And the last is going to be a class of I don't know, something like gallery. It's just images. And then our last section on the website is going to have a class of footer. And then I actually want to simulate what's at the top, at the bottom, so we can essentially bring down those elements here. And just copy and paste those down, and instead of logo, we're just going to call this, we're going to add to it and say footer logo, and we're going to say footer nav, like that. So we'll just make this a little bit more distinguished. There are going to be some general styles for the logo, and then there's going to be some specific things that we do, maybe with the footer logo. But the nav links, you know, this is sort of generic, and it's going to fit whatever we want. Footer nav, it's going to fit whatever we want. Okay, I think that is our HTML. So when we look at it here, we can see that we have all of the elements that were on this page here. And now we need to just sort of work on the layouts. And the first thing that we need to do is connect this to, well, to build out our supergrid, our superstructure, our 12 columns. So we're building out these 12 columns onto the canvas, essentially. Our app is going to be, our app here is going to be the canvas. So we're going to say app display grid, and we're going to say grid template columns, and that's going to be repeat 12 columns, 1 fractional unit per column. So they're going to take up the entire width of the page, and each column is going to, it's basically going to divide the page up into 12 columns, and they're going to be an equal width, each column. Let's give it a little bit of a gap of 1 rem, and so now it's not going to be, it's going to be divided up as 12 columns plus 16 pixels between each column, so not the same as if you had a gap of 0. Let's do it like that, and this needs this, and I think that's all for our that's all for that. We need to give this header a class, and we're just going to call that Masthead. So I grew up in the doing newspaper and stuff like that, so Masthead is the top section of everything. So now you see everything is display grid, so everything is sort of being laid out on a grid, a 12 column grid, which is not exactly what we want. In fact, if we come in and we can just do sort of an overarching responsive images, we can say width 100%, and then we'll display each of the images as a block. There's a little bit of padding underneath each one, or margin, I can't remember, but you can get rid of that by saying display block. And so now you can see the way we have our website is laid out in 12 columns, but the only things being activated right now are the header and these sections. The section, the article, this section, and the footer. They're the children, they're the child elements of, I don't know if I can show this to where it's easier to see. Okay, that's it. So let's just close these sections up, and then you'll be able to see more clearly. Okay, so our app is our grid. Our child elements are here. These are the children of the grid. So they're the only ones that are taking the grid right now. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then these are our 5 sections. So they're the only ones who have access to this grid that we applied to .app. Now, we need to connect all the things that are inside this, inside these sections, these child elements, the grandchildren, so to speak, these grandchildren here. We need to also connect them to this app. And the way that we're going to do that, just sort of all at once, is I'm going to say we can use specific names or we can use the HTML tags, either one. I'll show you both. So we could do a header, and we could say footer, section, and article. So those are the HTML sort of semantic tags that we have. Then we need to come in. My CSS is rusty. So we're going to come in here, and we're going to say display grid. So when you want to use subgrid, the grid that you're going to use subgrid on needs to actually be called display grid. If you don't add that, it won't actually do the subgrid. So we're going to say display grid, and then we're going to say grid template columns, and here's where we add the actual subgrid keyword, the property. So now now what happened is each of these things, the header, the footer, the section, and the article, so wherever you see that here, they're actually going to take on this, if they are children of app, they're going to take on and pass on this repeat 12 1FR. They're going to pass that on to their children. So now the children of all of these elements, if they are part of a grid, are going to pass that along to their children. So that's how it works. I'll show you here using specific names. You know, we've named everything, so our header is called Masthead. The footer is called footer. One section is called intro, and then one section is called article. Oh, actually we have that. And then one section is called gallery, right? Okay, so if we do that, and then we can hide this, the same thing happens. Nothing has changed over here because it just is what it is. If we look at this, what we've got so far in the browser, then you can see that there are rows and there are columns that are being laid out here per the sections and per the things that are on the grid. So what happens now is everything inside here is on the 12 column grid. It has access to it. But also all of these elements here have access to the grid. And one of the things that I found out is that if you want, because these all have access to the grid, they're all going to be laid out as one column. So you can see here these two things. So this navigation item and this item here are inside of Masthead, but Masthead isn't taking up the full width. It's only taking up one column of our 12 columns. So for us to be able to utilize and build out what we need here, we need Masthead, which would basically be this dark color back here. We need that section to take up the full width of our grid. And we can do that by just coming in and putting, we can do it individually like this. We can say Masthead, and we can say grid column 1 to -1, and whenever you use the 1 to -1, it means that that section takes up the entire grid. So it goes from 1 all the way to the end. We could just as easily actually write 13, which is the end line, and it doesn't change anything. So 1 is the beginning line, and 13 is the ending line track of the grid. Okay, so whether you use 13 or, I don't know if span will work here, but maybe span 12 should actually work as well. So you can span 12 columns, or you can make this number 13, which is the same thing as going from the first track line to the very last track line, or you can use -1. And that is just sort of a shorthand way to get you all the way across the page. So now Masthead, not the inside items, but the outer container masthead, is taking up the entirety of this grid. All 12 columns, it's filling them. You can see this whenever we put a background on it. So we put a background on it, and if we were to change this to, let's say 8, then you would see that it only goes from 1 to 8. And you see it starts at line 1 and it goes to line 8. So it takes up the first 7 columns of this 12 column grid. And because it's not taking up the full space across, nothing is being pushed down. So it's just filling in the rest of the grid as we go along, which is not what we want. What we want is for this section to actually take up the entire grid, which means we say 1 to -1, and that takes up the entire space. Now we need to come up here and do some cleaning up. Just some general styles. Those are called nav links, and we're going to say list style of none, and padding of 0, and margin of 0. And then we're also going to do a display flex. And so that flexes our navigation items like this, and our our footer navigation items as well. Now you can see that everything is all jammed up here, and this isn't exactly what we want. What we want is for each of these sections to actually take up, just like this one does. We want each of these sections to take up the full width of our grid. So I think an easier way than doing it this way is to take this grid column, and since we already have all of these sections bunched together, if we put it there, then that means it's going to add it to all of our masthead, footer, intro, gallery, article. All of our sections are going to now take up 100% of the space. So you can see how everything is sort of looking a little bit more like what we have here, where we have these individual elements inside of each section. So our first section, our intro, has an image and it has some text, and then our second section has an image, text, and a caption. So you can see that it's all sort of laid out for us, at least grouped together in a better way. So now it's just up to us to go through and to style each of, actually we need to place each of our elements inside of our child elements. So these are all the grandparent or the grandchild elements. We need to put them onto our super grid, our 12 column grid. And that's exactly the way that we think about it. Whenever we're working in a program like this, we're thinking about, we're thinking about how can we take these individual elements and place them on this 12 column grid, this canvas. So that's what I mean by saying that I think it's going to change everything, is that it's going to change our workflow to sort of mirror and match what designers have always done. Before, we would need to create our own grids inside of each of these sections and think of these as sort of unrelated boxes. So this is, this is one box, this is all one box, this is its own box, and then we just sort of stack those boxes on top of each other and create the layout that we want and hope that, we can figure out the math to be able to match everything up in 12 columns like the designer wanted. But this time, we are coding in the same way that our designer took all these elements and put them on to a 12 column grid, which is overlaid on some underlying canvas. For us, the canvas is the app, .app, and the elements are each of the individual elements. So again, if you watch the second video, that would be really helpful to be able to understand conceptually what I'm talking about. So we need to come and deal with each of our individual elements. So what we have here is we have a logo and we have a main nav. So these are our two grandchildren elements. And for this one, nothing's going to happen with our elements here. As far as I know, we can only go to the grandchildren. We can't go deeper than that. I've tried and it doesn't work. So I assume that that's not possible. So you can't take each of these individual elements and attach them to the grid in some way. You would need to create your own grid for these elements. But we can lay out the logo and then all of these elements as a group. We can lay them out to the grid. And if we look at our design, we have our logo beginning at track line 1 and going to 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1 to 4, it's taking up 3 columns. And then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then starting at 8 and going to 13. So the end of our 12 column grid is 13, track number 13. So 8 to 13, 1 to 4, and so we just need to reflect that in our code. So we come down and we say logo, I want you to start at grid column 1, and I want you to go and stop at grid column 4. So you're not going to see a lot of change up here. I also want to make some changes to the logo itself. I want to say font size, I don't know, something like 6 rem. It's going to be big, and we're going to get rid of our margin. So that looks fine to me. Actually, text transform. We'll do that. We'll make it all uppercase letters. And then now we need to deal with our main nav. So we say main nav, grid column, I want you to start at grid column 8, and I want you to go to 13. I think I'm going to change this a little bit, but you can see that it snapped itself. We have not applied any actual grid template columns to the masthead itself. It's taking on the 12 columns here. So if we get rid of this, you can see that it will change our masthead. Should change our masthead. Okay, well, it's changed everything else, so you can see that as well. can see it very effectively up here. That it's hard to see the columns unless you do the spacing or the inspector. So you can see here that our grid is here, and this is all display grid. And okay, so now you can see our grid laid out, and you can see that it starts at where did I miss it? Where did I miss it? So masthead, column 1. Something is not right. Because it should be going to right here. What did I change? Okay. Now we're back to where we were. Let's see if that helps. Okay. Well, it's not helping. So grid line 1, 2, 3. I think we can turn those on. Can display all the line numbers. So grid line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we can see that it goes to 8, but it should be going all the way to 13. Well, let's power through and let's see if we can continue forward, and laying out these elements will actually help. Let's see if that works. It could be that I've messed something up or not. So the next thing that we need to deal with is our intro. And the intro has a P and the intro has an image. So in our design, we have an image on the left, and it starts at grid line 1. And it goes to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it takes up 6 columns, which is half the page. So we want it to go from grid line 1 to grid line 6. And I'll keep clicking on that. So let's say intro image, and we want it to start at grid column 1, and we want it to go to track number 7. Okay, so now what happens is this one is still first in the source order, and so it's still placing it on the implicit grid, and this one's been placed explicitly, and because there's already something here in column 1, it just pushes it down to the next row. So it's sort of laying things out automatically, and because you're not specifying which row it should be in, it's just going to pop it down to the next row where it can actually go from column 1 or track 1 to track 7. So if we do our intro P and we start it where it needs to go, which is so this is 7, 8. So it starts at 8 and goes to 13, just like our menu. So we can in fact just copy that down to here, and now you see that it's here, but it's still acting like this is the default row 1, right? Or actually it'd be row 1, row 2, row 3. So we need to actually explicitly put grid row 2 so that they wind up on the same line together. And the way that we can think about it is this is going to be grid row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I believe that's how it's going to work. So that's what we're going to do, and that will allow us to place the items exactly where we want them to go on the page. And so let's save that and see if it's being reflected here yet. Okay, it is being reflected here. The reason that this is not Okay, so the word stops here. I think it actually is taking up that space there. So let's see. The logo, it's only taking up to column 2 because I think it's not longer. Maybe we can see that if we add to it. Okay. So that should be able to show us that it's actually going to take up more space. If it could fill in this space here, it would, if that makes sense. Maybe this will work. Something like that. Okay. So if it would take up that space, then it would. It's hard. That's not a good way to explain it. But some reason it is only taking up column 1. It's very weird. So, oh, that's why. You have to spell things right. So that's why it's not working. So I'm glad I found that. But you do have to spell things right in the code for it to work. So who hasn't been there, right? So now it should stretch out. Yeah, so it stretches itself out. You can see that it goes to grid column 4. So I'm glad I chased that rabbit, because now I know that there was an error there. So that's what we wanted from that. And the reason that this is not farther, we had set it to be from 8 to 13. So you can see there our main nav. It's actually laid out 8 to 13. You can see our nav links go from 8 to 13. But the reason that it's not is because it's just physically not taking up that much space, so which we can deal with in just a bit. So we got this laid out here, and we can see from here that it goes from grid line 1 to line 7. This one starts at 8 and goes to 13. So this is exactly what we want from our code. And we're just going to keep powering through this. Let's go down to our, I think it's called article. And we'll start with the image. That's the one that we want to be visually first. So the image is going to be on top. And we're going to say article image grid column. Where does it start? It starts track 1, 2, 3. So it starts at 3. And this is 13, 12, 11. So from 3 to 11, that's where our image is going to be. So we say 3 to 11. And now our image is going to stretch across, starting at grid line 3 to 11. But you see, because we place this, it's sort of like putting a rock in the water. Everything gets displaced around it. It doesn't automatically get pushed down to the next line because there's still space enough for this to take up its one column here. And it's first in source order, so it's just going to put itself there on the grid and just sort of lay itself out around these more fixed elements. So as you play with grid, you start to see how things work, how the grid is being manipulated. If you need more of a primer on actually using CSS Grid, there's lots of good tutorials out there. I have a playlist that shows you how to deal with placement and putting things on the grid, so you can check that out. And now we need to explicitly place these two particular items. And one is the text. It's going to start in track 3 and go to 4, 5, 6. So let's do that. So we're going to say article P, and we're going to say, I believe it's going to be first. Maybe we can use first. There's some pseudo elements that I want to try to work in. So we'll say grid column 3, and that goes to 6. So we'll see if that'll do it. It might be first child. Okay, so that worked. It put it not at the default, which is track 1. It put it at starting in track 3 and going to track 6. But we want this to actually be inverted. We want this one to be on top, and we want this to be down below. So if we come here and we say grid row, remember this was grid row 2, so we want this one to actually be on grid row 3, and then we want this one to be on grid row 4. Okay, so now that inverts it. That puts this one in row 3. This one hasn't been expressed for anything, so it's filling in just on the implicit grid like it's supposed to. It's filling in whatever space it can find, because this one has been expressly put on track number 3, so it actually puts it before, even though in the source order it's after the image. So it's all kind of weird. It's very fluid, so you just have to remember that. But we're going to move this one right here, which is where it is in our design. So this one starts, so this is track 6, 7, 8. So it starts in 8. We're preserving this line here, which is good design. You're preserving this sort of vertical line through the middle at the 2/3 point. So it starts at 8 and it goes to whatever the end of this is, which is 11. So we need to add that to our caption, and we could say article P, and we can give it the last child since it's the last one, and we could say grid column 8, and it goes to 11. Okay, so now you can see that it has moved it over on this vertical line, which is track line 8, and it's only going to the end of the image, and then it's wrapping. But we need it to be also on grid row 4, because we need this one to be, this is row 2, row 3, row 4. So even though these two things are in the same section, they're on different rows of the grid, and I'll show you what it looks like on the actual grid up here. Because our grid is sort of outside of those sections. Everything is in relation to the grid, right? So you can see that this is row 2, and that this is row 3 here. And it's telling me that this is track 4, but this is actually going to be our row 4 explicitly. So track 4, row 4, a little bit different whenever it's put here. Just make sure that's it. Yep. Okay. So we have everything done for this section, and now we have one more of our sections, and that's down here, and that's going to be called gallery, and it's gallery image. Same thing, we can use the first child pseudo selector, and we can say the first child is going to start at column 3, and then it's going to go to 6, 7, 8, right? So it's lined up with our one long line through here. So it's going to be 3 to 8. So we say grid column 3, and then it's going to go to track 8. So from grid track 3, which lines up here, to 8, which lines up sort of with our long line through the entire text. And then this one we need to place. So this is 8, 9, 10. So 10 through 13. So we'll come here, and since there's only 2 items, we can do the same thing as we did with the elements before, And you can say last child, and that's going to be 10 to 13. So now this one has been placed on grid track 10, and it goes to 13. And because our images are being sized automatically with our width of 100%, they're taking up the fullness of that column from one column to another. They're taking up all that space and resizing themselves, which is nice. We're not having to manipulate the sizes or anything like that, and the sizes are going to shrink and grow as we go. So they're taking up, you know, it's sort of responsive or elastic by default. Now what we want is for the baselines of these to match up, and because everything is on a grid and a part of the grid specification, we can actually come in here and we could say align self. And what align self does is it controls the vertical axis of this particular this gallery image, the last child. We can put it anywhere we want. The default is start, which is at the top. You could say center, which would center it. You can see the centering here, and what it's doing is it's centering it inside of the row. Okay, so it's controlling the vertical centering or the vertical alignment inside of the row that it's in. You could also do baseline, which is going to get us not where we want. That would be something maybe you would use for text, but what we want is to actually put it, got a spell? We want to put it at the end. So start is at the top, end is at the bottom. This is just terminology you need to use for grid. And it's just one of those things. So now we have this section here. So it starts here and ends here. They're lined up on the bottom edges, not on the top edges. And then we have our last section here, which is our footer. So let's go ahead and take our footer, and we'll give it a background of, we can use the same color as the top up here. And we're going to shape up some of these things. You can see that it's sort of rolling itself around. If we come through, we had changed this to footer nav, but if we just give this main nav, if we just give it the same class, it's actually going to lay itself out on the grid just like we have up here, and those two are going to be connected. You can see they're the same. There's no real reason necessarily to have footer nav be different, because in our design it's exactly the same. You can see that they're the same. So what we're going to do is line these things up better, and again we can go to our main nav. Where is it at? And we can say align self to the center, and then that should center it up with this item here. And then I actually want to make sure that this covers all of this space here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give on our main nav, I'm going to set it to display flex, and you can see sort of how Flexbox works with grid here. And we're going to say justify content space between, and this is a way for you to space out the items inside the space they're supposed to take up. Let's see if it does it. Will it do it? Will it do it? Space between. Maybe it won't do it. Okay. Well, it should do that. Let's think. It's not main nav that we want. It's on the main nav unordered list. What's that called? That's called nav links. Okay. So I just have it on the wrong element. What I want is not main nav, which takes up the entire container. I want it to be the actual navigation. So let's just cut this, and we'll put it up here where our main nav links is. So it's already display flex. We just need to add justify content and space between. Okay, so that should work. Okay, so now that spaces out our navigation inside of the larger container. So let's look at what we got going on over here, where we can see our actual grid layout. So you can see how everything is being placed on the grid. The items here are being placed. And then you can see our elements spaced out all across here and being spaced out also down here because we connected them with that nav links class, and main nav is here. So everything that gets taken down here is happening up here at the top as well. And what I don't like is how tight everything is. You can see that there's quite a bit of spacing, you know, for each section. There's some spacing on the edges and spacing here. And I worked a little bit with controlling the width of each of the major elements, like the header, the sections, the article, etc. And that just didn't do what I thought. It sort of shrunk the grid down, and it keeps the grid. You could put a max width if you wanted to on app. You know, you could say max width of 1,000 pixels in the margin of auto, like that, and it would keep it from going all the way to the edges, but it would also give you this sort of boxed in kind of feel. So if that's what you're looking for, then you could do that, and it basically just shrinks down your grid so that your grid columns again are just taking up 12 columns across your grid element or your app element. And then, you know, it's just shrinking up. It's just making these equal spaces. Okay, so that's all you're doing. So if you want this sort of box look, it's going to create a box look at the bottom and the top as well. That's not exactly what I was going for. What I'm going for is all the way across. So I don't want to put a maximum width on the app. What I want to do, you can tell which browser is my normal browser. What I want to do is I want to put some padding on the app. Okay. So, and we'll say something like, I don't know. It could be any number that you want. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not where we want to put it. Again, we run into the same issue. So if we put it on the grid, we're going to have this not be able to go to the edges. So it looks fine on some of the internal parts, but when you get to the colored sections, it's not going to look very good, which we're going to put a background color on this section also. So we need to take that padding and we need to apply it to each individual sort of child element here. Okay, so let's do that. And so when we put our padding on each individual child element, we still get our child elements going all the way to the edges, but inside we've created some padding for each of our child elements. Now this may or may not be a great solution for this. It might be a better solution just to put everything one space in on the grid. However you choose to do that is fine. So instead of this starting at line 1, it would start at track line 2, and etc. Everything that starts on 1 would end on 2. Everything that everything that starts on 1 would start on 2. Everything that ends on 13 would end at 12. And so you would have sort of like a 1 column gap on the edges of your screen. That's one way to do it. This is another way to do it. It just depends on what you need inside of your grid, I guess. If you don't mind padding, this is one way. If the padding is going to throw things off, then just move it 1 or 2 columns in, and that'll always give you that buffer on the outside, but it'll kind of throw off your 12 columns, right? So we want the we don't want anything on the top and bottom. Is that what we want? Some things yes, some things no. So for all of them, we can set the top and bottom to 0, which is going to look good for this, and that's going to look good for this, but it doesn't really help with these. Remember, we want some padding in these sections. So if we just take these sections here, copy those, we can set some values just for them. So maybe we want our padding for them to be like 6 on the top and bottom, and then we'll preserve that 3 rem on the edges so that it lines up on the sides left and right. So now we have a little bit more space, which feels a little bit more comfortable. Maybe it's too much space now though. So we could say, we could half that and just say everything is 3 rem. And then for this, what's it called? It's called article. Let's give it a background also of a very light gray. And then now that sort of matches and sets off that article section. But we still preserve our padding, we still preserve our grid, and when we come in at a really large size, it looks essentially like what we have in our design down here. So this is our design with some padding. You know, it goes, there's some spacing in between the sections, top and bottom, but also on the edges of the design. So maybe that's a hacky way to do it, maybe not. This gets a little bit too spread out for me, and so maybe at a really large size I would want to do something like take our main nav and where's it at? Instead of 8, maybe I would push that to 9. And so just sort of push it over to the left a little bit. So at a larger size, maybe I would want to do something like that, where I control the space a little bit more, or just keep them all together instead of using space between with the flex box, and then just manipulate how much space is between each individual image by going to the list item and giving it some margin or something like that. That way you could control this space a little bit more. But right now it's super flexible, and it looks good all throughout. So as it stretches out, you can see these gaps stretching out a little bit. But the whole thing is very flexible, and maybe, you know, at this size here, you would want to start manipulating, what size is that? So 1,000 pixels. You might want to start manipulating how this might morph and change based on different media queries and sizes of things. So maybe this might want to come out a little bit closer over here at smaller sizes or something. So this is generally how it's done. And if we look at our structure here, we can see that it's pretty flat. So we have the body, which is sort of implied with Codepen. And then inside that we have this sort of wrapper app, and that's going to be our grid, our overarching super grid. We have our header, and then our section, and then we have an article, another section, and our footer. So that's sort of our first hierarchical layer of content, and then each of those has some hierarchy inside of it, and it really doesn't go too deep until you get to the navigation, which that's just going to be the nature of navigation, to have to build out something that's sort of hierarchical. because especially if you're going to use an unordered list, if you're going to use that, then it's going to get a little bit more. If you want these to be links, you're going to have to add anchor tags to them, and etc. So there is going to be a little bit of hierarchy inside of our navigation, just because that's how it works. But you can see that it's pretty, there are no wrapper divs on each of these elements, which I might want to do if I was creating a grid out of this intro section. I might want to have separate wrapper divs for each of these elements, just to control the layout. I find it easier than having to just manipulate regular elements by themselves. But you can see that it's no issue taking the regular elements and putting them onto the grid. So I think what's going to happen is, at least for me and the way that I write, that's going to flatten this section right here. Normally I would have another hierarchical sort of meta layer between intro. I would have an intro inner, which would help me to control maximum width and spacing on the inside of the section. And then I might even have a wrapping div over each of these particular elements. So that's at least one layer, maybe two layers of the hierarchy that don't even need to be there. They're only there for layout purposes. So that's two things that I could just remove from the code because these are now connected up, instead of having to figure out how all of this information inside this section is related to each other. So now it's all related to the grid. So that's what I mean by this is going to change forever, at least for me. Once it becomes implemented in all browsers, it's going to change the way that I think about how I'm manipulating elements on the grid, and how all of the elements of the page relate to one another, as opposed to relating only to the things that are inside their direct parents, if that makes some sense. So we wound up with our example. The site doesn't look any different probably than I would normally create the site. It's just that underneath everything is flatter. The HTML is more understandable because I don't have a bunch of classes all over the place. I'm not having to, it's more semantic because there's no wrapping classes all over the place. I can use actual HTML elements as opposed to using, you know, divs and stuff like that I have to give made up names to and things in order to make them understandable. And hopefully that's going to lead to less HTML. It's going to lead to more straightforward writing, means more straightforward debugging, and less CSS, because we're having to write less, honestly, because we're not including, we're using some of these pseudo selectors. You can use pseudo selectors to target lots of different elements on the page or in a particular section. You can modularize them by putting them inside of a section like this, sort of this layer here. These sections represent sort of a pseudo or a meta layer that you can create components from. So hopefully this helps to understand a little bit more about what I've been saying in the first couple of videos. Again, if you haven't seen those videos, go back and watch them. And I'll try to create a couple more examples and see, you know, just kind of push this idea a little bit and see how crazy it can go. And we'll see in the next video. Maybe I'll try to do a more complete responsive design. This isn't responsive at all. It's just sort of looking at one example of a single page on a desktop view. But then how can we manipulate those elements at different breakpoints, and what problems do we run into, and how can we solve those problems? That's what I'm trying to do in this series. And so if you haven't subscribed to the channel, just click subscribe, and then if you click the bell icon, then you'll get notified every time that I upload a new video. And if you like the video, please click the thumbs up. It's a super easy way to kind of pay it forward, and helps YouTube recognize this as valuable content. So if it was valuable to you, click the thumbs up. If it was really valuable to you, share it with your community. That would be awesome. I would love that. And if you want to connect with me on Twitter, that link is down in the comment section as well. If you want to see this code, there'll be a link to that, not in the comments, in the description. So there'll be a link to this code in the description. Remember, you have to use Firefox in order to see this, at least for right now when this video is being shot in July 2020. This is the only browser that has Subgrid capability. So the newest version of Firefox, you'll be able to see that. So if you just open the link with Firefox, you can see all of these things and how they take place. Feel free to fork this and to make it your own, manipulate it, work with it, see how different things change based on choices that you make with Subgrid. And I think that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.